handout. Did everybody get one?
Yes, but I don't have a color like you.
I don't have a color printer at work. Sorry, I should have sent it to you.
No. Sorry.
So there is a long, involved handout, but you really only have to observe the first page. That's where the outline of the talk is.
There's not going to be a test.
Are you kidding me?
No,
I'm not grading it.
You're set.
All right. So the talk, this is really the book talk, and one way to think about what is going on in the book Glittering Vices is trying to think about where the story of the 7 deadly sins started. Where did that whole tradition of 7 deadly sins even come from? And then to link that historically also to spiritual formation. So you might think, oh, the 7 deadly sins, they're scary and sinful and all that stuff. And really the story of the 7 deadly sins is how we get free from sin. So what I want to do is go back, explore what that tradition was like, where things came from, and also how we can be now informed by it today, how we can use that tradition to think about our own spiritual lives and our own spiritual formation. So that's where we're headed. The way the talk goes is really why the 7 deadly sins are not 7, are not best called deadly, and aren't really best known as sins. They'd be better known as the 8 or 9 capital vices. So I'm going to try to narrate that shift for you by going back in history a little bit. But I also want to make a case for why we should study them today, and that's where we're going to start. So the first point on your handout is the 7 deadly sins seriously, because of course our culture doesn't take sin very seriously at all. So let's start with where things stand culturally in the conversation about sin in general. Here's Frank and Ernest and their commentary on their sleeping brother here under the tree is, unfortunately, the only way Brother Ernest can overcome his gluttony, presumably he overate at lunch, is with sloth, otherwise known as a good nap. Okay, so no big deal, sloth is just a nap under a tree. There's worse things. There's also a website, deadlysins.com, that will sell you a t-shirt for each one of the sins, color-coded according to the sin. Pride is, of course, purple. And it will give you a synopsis of each one of the sins. Get it? Okay. Pride is the excessive belief in your own abilities. It will describe what it is. It will tell you where you got your pride from. Well-meaning elementary school teachers who told you to believe in yourself. Sort of pride is just the self-esteem movement gone awry. And like I said, you're welcome to purchase the t-shirt with, in this case, the horse, sort of pride goeth before a fall. On the same website, there used to be a recipe for double peanut butter paisley brownies, which I thought was excellent. And they would warn you about overeating, going to Overeaters Anonymous, being forced to eat rats, toads, and snakes in hell. And listen, if you think being fat is the worst thing to worry about, let me tell you what the spiritual consequences of this are. But the whole story about gluttony on the website is too many brownies. You're going to get fat. And I'm here to tell you right now, if gluttony is a spiritual condition of the heart, your weight is probably irrelevant. Okay, you can be thin, fit, an exercise guru, and still have a gluttony problem. Right? So again, a kind of tongue-in-cheek, but very misleading conception of gluttony. Now, the Harper's Magazine did a spoof issue on the 7 deadly sins, where they hired 7 Madison Avenue ad agencies to create advertisements for the sins. So how do you sell lust? How do you sell gluttony? How do you sell sloth? And this is the one for lust. The tagline is lust. Where would we be without it? Quite literally, right? How would the human race go on? Any sin that's enabled us to survive centuries of war, death, pestilence, and famine can't be called deadly, get it? Right? It's the thing that keeps the...
Where would we be without it?
Yeah, exactly.
Fine print.
So this is the spoof ad for sloth. If the original sin had been sloth, we'd still be in paradise. Presumably because we would be too lazy to commit any of the really bad sins, like that involved getting up and actually picking fruit or something. There are 7 deadly sins of home remodeling, 7 deadly sins of marketing, 7 deadly sins of HR, 7 deadly sins of small group ministry, 7 deadly sins of professors, 7 deadly sins of students. It's just become a rhetorical trope for talking about anything. So not a whole lot of seriousness there. And somebody even thought about your computer keyboard in terms of the 7 deadly sins. And I'll just point out this one, Control S is how you save your document. So if you want to save yourself, you can Control S.
Save yourself.
There are 7 deadly sins out there, even in Disneyland or in SpongeBob, depending on the cartoon you watch. And there are even games called the 7 deadly sins, which tell you that knowledge can get you places, but you've got to sin to win. So I actually own this game. I'm ashamed to admit. And I bought it thinking I could play it in class, you know, and so it's sort of like Trivial Pursuit. You answer all these questions about the sins, and then you switch decks at that point to the sin to win cards. And it turns out you have to commit all 7 in order to, you know, depending on the card you draw, it will tell you, you know, what sin of envy to commit on the spot, and that earns you all the way down to the center of the game board, which is the little devil with a pitchfork who gives you your spot in hell. At any rate, you can toast your victory if you win the game with a bottle of Zinferno or a bottle of the 7 deadly Zins. They're both Zinfandels. Okay. And last but not least, you can order your wristbands in the Archie McPhee catalog, and you can flaunt your deadly flaw. So if you're wearing your Wrath wristband on a given day, people know to watch out. Okay. Now you can tell that this obviously is very trivial. It's a lot of silliness, it's a lot of marketing gimmickry, it's a lot of empty rhetoric. The cultural conversation is that the 7 deadly sins are just some archaic old tradition that now we can turn into some kind of just simple marketing ploy, something shallow. On the other hand, if you go to the church, often this is the picture of sin that you get. It's not trivialized, but it feels a whole lot like God looking down at you and making you feel tiny and in shame, like the kid with the hand in the cookie jar, okay? And I don't know that that's the most constructive image of our relationship to God when it comes to sin. And I'm going to suggest a different way in tonight to think about sin in this context, in this tradition, as self-destruction. So in the book of Proverbs in Scripture, the proverb writer says, "For our ways are in full view of the Lord. He examines all our paths. The evil deeds of the wicked ensnare them. The cords of sin hold them fast." Have you ever thought about sin as a kind of bondage, being in chains? "They will die for lack of discipline," says the proverb writer, "led astray by their own great folly." So the picture here is of sin as a kind of self-destruction. That's a kind of slavery or a kind of bondage. And that's an image that shows up in St. Augustine, and it also shows up even earlier in the 7 deadly sins tradition. So you know the wisdom literature is all about your way of life. So Psalm 1 begins, there's the way of the righteous and the way of the wicked. So there's 2 ways. You either follow the way of wisdom, and that's the way of life, or you follow the way of folly, and that's the way of death. So the problem with sin is that you destroy yourself. You head down the path toward death. Okay? And that's governed by a kind of folly. It's the wrong way to live. It's not what you're made for. You're made for life. So think of God as inviting you toward life, and you instead choosing to head down a different path. That's the metaphor we'll explore in the rest of the talk. N.T. Wright is a Reformed theologian who puts the point this way. Christians seem to me to divide into 2 groups nowadays. The first lot don't think sin matters very much anyway. It's like grace and glory and praise assemblies and woohoo, wave your hands in the air, right? Praise Jesus. And then there's the second camp that takes sin very seriously but still can't kick the habit. All right, so let's think about the ways in which sin becomes habitual. All right, all that by way of warm-up. Let me explain to you why I got into this topic. And I'll just go back. This is the story that opens the book, Glittering Vices. And it goes like this, and it's a true story. It's a story about me, actually. I was in graduate school at the University of Notre Dame. And I was sitting in a class full of really, really smart people who were aspired to be really, really smart philosophers. And I was pretty sure I was the dumbest person in the room. Have you ever had that feeling? You get put enough smart people together and suddenly you're the little fish in the big sea. And I kept thinking, I'm not smart enough to be here. I don't think I belong. Maybe they're going to find me out and kind of kick me out the back door in shame, right? As soon as I get exposed for the imposter that I feel like I am. Now, psychology will tell you that imposter syndrome is in fact very common, but I didn't know that, okay, when I was a 23-year-old sitting in graduate school during the first semester of classes. And so I was struggling with this sense of, I want to shrink back, I don't necessarily want to say anything, I don't want to put myself out there in case I'm exposed. And I was reading Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologia a year later and discovered a name for this. And the name was, there it is, pusillanimity. Want to say that one out loud? Pusillanimity. It means smallness of soul.
Smallest?
Smallness of soul. So think of it as when God calls you to great things, you look up terrified and shrink back and go, no, I don't think so. Not me, not right now. I just can't do it. And Aquinas' picture of pusillanimity was Moses of the burning bush. So at the calling of Moses to come and lead the people of Israel out of slavery in the Exodus, and he said, I'm not sure I can do this. I really have a lot of sheep to take care of. Did you remember that I stuttered, Lord? I'm not a very good leader. Can you send Aaron instead? I mean, it's all excuses. It's all shrinking back. It's all, I can't. And Aquinas' diagnosis for Moses is, look, Moses' problem is that he's focused on his own failure. And he's not looking toward the power of God. And it was like somebody turned the light bulb on for me. Because what I had was the name of what I was struggling with. It wasn't I wasn't the only person who felt this way. Even Moses had felt this way. And Aquinas gave me a diagnosis, gave me a name for the thing that was holding me back, the thing that was keeping me in bondage. And even just to know the name for it was in some sense liberating. It was like an epiphany. And the tradition also showed me a way forward, because the solution, of course, is to stop looking at your own puny skill set and to try to think about the power of God and what it can equip you to do. And so to turn my focus away from my own efforts and toward God, the tradition also gifted me with a practice called Sabbath keeping. Instead of working around the clock 7 days a week on your own puny efforts, which will never be enough, one day a week you lay it down and you remember who's in charge. You remember who has the power, and you remember who equips you with everything you need to carry out whatever he calls you to do. So for me, this diagnosis was actually a moment of freedom, epiphany, relief. It was also a path toward life, because the practice I engaged in to overcome the pusillanimity was also a practice that opened me to the power of God and letting his life be in me. So that's the story of how I got into this stuff. Because here's the secret. Pusillanimity is connected to sloth. And as soon as I started investigating sloth, I found out it was one of the 7 deadly sins. So here we go, back to the desert. Where did this tradition come from? We'll talk about the number 7 here of the 7 deadly sins. The Desert Fathers and mothers, frankly, Amos, Sarah, Amos and Cletica, and many others, were in the desert, and this is happening in the early centuries of the Christian church. So we're just past the point where the early church has been under intense persecution. And suddenly, Christianity is allowable, it's a permissible religion, and in fact, Christians are moving into positions of social power, economic power, and political power. Now the danger isn't, will I falter under persecution? Now the danger for Christians is, will I be co-opted by the world? Will I assimilate and become just like everybody else in power? A lover of political power, more in love with my own wealth than in love with God. And so there was a group of Christians following St. Anthony who went out into the desert as a way of taking themselves out of that arena of worldliness and trying to craft a new way of life for themselves. And what they did in the desert, Evagrius of Pontus is the first one who wrote things down, because he was one of the more literate guys out there in the desert. They went to the desert to follow Christ. Think Matthew 4, Luke 4, Christ's temptation in the desert. So if you're going to follow Christ, before Christ gets into his ministry, he goes out into the desert right after his baptism. So you're called by God in baptism, sent out, driven out by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tested. So the monks are like, okay, we've been called by God, off to the desert we go. And there's a period of testing that they felt like they had to undergo before they were ready to engage in their positive ministry. And this period of testing involved the 7 deadly sins. Okay? So this is actually the Nile Delta region in what is now Egypt. And you can see Alexandria here. And these X's here are the little communities where these clusters of Christian monastics, early monastics, were living. And this is an actual excavation of Kelia. And you can see all the network of cells in these desert communities. So here's the list that this group of monks came up with. Gula or gluttony, luxuria or lust, avaritia, which is greed or avarice, ira, which is wrath, tristitia, which is a particular kind of sorrow or dejection that comes with having to give up all your worldly possessions. It's a kind of, oh, I miss my old life kind of tristitia, kind of sorrow. Invidia is envy, that was added later. Acadia or sloth, vanagloria or ananisgloria, which is vainglory, and then last but not least, of course, pride. And this is Cassian's list. He's ordering the vices from vices that have a material object or a sensory pleasure as their object, something associated with the body or the physical. And the vices go all the way down the continuum to vices that have a purely spiritual object, where pride and vainglory have to do with your reputation or your status. That isn't something physical. Okay? So there's a kind of gradation here. But how many do we have?
8.
9.
8, 9, depending on when, if you count the additions and the ones that dropped out. Yeah, right.
Is there a suggestion here that the carnal vices are somehow worse than the spiritual vices?
No, in fact, the other way around.
Oh.
Yeah. So these are probably the more obvious of the vices, and if you have a young monk, this is usually where things start, and then this is a kind of progression in spiritual discipline. You kind of work deeper and deeper and deeper. Start with the obvious behavioral stuff, work inward and inward toward the spirit, more spiritual and maybe more invisible vices. Funny that you asked, because what Cassian actually says is, what often happens is that you work through the first 6 and you get to sloth, and then you look back on your spiritual progress and you say, wow, I've come a really long way. Look at me. Oh wait, that's vainglory. Or you say, oh my goodness, I've made so much progress. Good job, me. And that's to take credit for your own spiritual maturity, and that's pride. So what vainglory and pride can do is undercut all your progress so far by being too self-congratulatory about it and forgetting that grace is behind this whole story. So we have 8, 9, sometimes 7, sometimes more. What's going on here? The number is not important. What's important about the vices is that they're sort of the desert fathers and mothers' top 10 list. So imagine that top 10 list. Here are the top 10 things that if you're going to make spiritual progress, you're going to move forward in spiritual formation, you're going to have to encounter these struggles. This is just sort of part of the doing the drill as a human being. And so think about somebody in the desert as a good psychologist. And they practice a kind of spiritual direction of young monks in the desert. And let's just say 3 or 4 decades into it, we asked them, what are the top 10 things that the people that you're tutoring, the people that you're mentoring, what are the top 10 things they're struggling with? It's this list. So the list really comes not from kind of some kind of systematic metaphysic or theology or book learning kind of thing. It really bubbles up from practice. It's really a kind of practical outgrowth of the spiritual direction that these particular Christian communities were practicing out in the desert. Now, the list of the virtues, on the other hand, there are 7 of those. Those come from philosophy, those come from scripture. So there's sort of canonical lists of 4 cardinal virtues, 3 theological virtues, and we can credit Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, the Greek thinkers with the 4 cardinal virtues. We can credit St. Paul with the theological virtues. They get picked up by Augustine. That list is almost always a set list of 7. This list is all over the place. This is a much messier, more pastoral enterprise. All right? And people often ask me, well, why don't the 7 vices line up with the 7 virtues? And I'm like, because they came from completely different places for completely different purposes. So the virtues in the Greek tradition are supposed to map the soul. And then we had to figure out what to do with the theological virtues. They somehow had to get stuck into that system. But the vices are not a soul map. They're really just, here are the top 10 things people struggle with when it comes to sin, when it comes to their relationship with God. You can almost guarantee you're going to struggle with something on this list. And quite possibly in this order. Okay? Why call these vices capital vices? I am going to say that the way the story goes is that they're first named capital or principal vices. And only later, like almost a millennia later, do they pick up the label deadly sins. And you know deadly sins comes from that mortal venial distinction in Catholic theology. But this practice, this list, predates that distinction by hundreds and hundreds of years. So what's the story behind the vices being capital vices? The Latin word that's behind this is capitis, which means head, and it doesn't mean we're going to cut off your head as in capital punishment. It really means a source or a principle of everything else.
Like the source of a river.
Right. That's exactly Cassian's metaphor. So wait for the next slide.
Oh, okay.
Way to think ahead.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. So Gregory the Great, Pope Gregory the First, says, when pride, the queen of the vices, has fully possessed your conquered heart, she surrenders it immediately to 7 principal sins, as if to her generals, and she tells them to lay it waste. So think of pride as the queen, the capital vices as the generals who carry out her orders. Okay, so he's thinking of that in sort of kind of sources of other sin. And he also says pride is the root of all evil, and the 7 principal vices as its first progeny spring from this poisonous root. So here's Cassian's metaphors for what makes a capital vice capital, what makes it a source vice. He calls it like a tree that spreads more easily if you're nourishing the roots. So we get a kind of organic metaphor for sin. The roots pull in the nutrients and sin organically grows. So if you're going to go after the vices, you have to cut off the branches, chop down the tree, and then grind the stump and get down to the root of everything. And likewise, this other picture is a spring from which a stream flows. So if you poison the spring carries all the water that comes from the spring down all the tributaries, poisons the whole land, pollutes the whole place, and it's all a big mess. And that's a picture of the way that sin works, according to the capital vices. So pride is the root on Gregory's system. The capital vices grow out of pride, the big 7. And then those vices, in turn, have other offshoot vices. All right, so we get a tree picture, and here's a tree picture. In fact, if you look on the back of your first page of your handout, you'll see this tree picture. So there's a bunch of medieval depictions of vice trees in the British Library's collection of illuminated manuscripts. So I'll just fast forward to the one that we'll talk about here. What do you see in this picture? This is a vice tree. It's in Latin, so don't try to read the text.
Well,
unless you know Latin.
It's kind of a mirror.
It's beautifully symmetrical.
Yeah.
Yes. So in that sense, we've cleaned the tradition up a little bit.
Is that, excuse me, is that supposed to be Adam and Eve on
Yes,
the bottom?
yes, good observation. So Adam and Eve, and they're eating the fruit from the snake. And that is a depiction of which sin? The original sin, according to Augustine, right? That's pride. So the root of the vices is pride. That's the label for the Adam and Eve picture here at the bottom. This Latin here says the way of death. These are the fruits of death. And then each branch coming up here, this is envy. This is avaritia or greed. This is anger. So each branch comes up, and you can see there are, this is vainglory, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 fruits dangling from each branch. So this is that picture of sin is organic. It's growing. It's not just going to sit there and stay in this kind of neutral, static state. It's going to keep growing and keep growing and keep growing. So you can't afford to just ignore it and let it fester. Okay. So each of the vices grows additional fruit. That's the picture we get here. You'll probably be heartened to know there's also a virtue tree. And these two folio pages are parallel facing pages in the actual manuscript from which it was found. And here, who's at the bottom of this picture, do you think?
Mary and Gabriel.
Yes, good call. So why is Mary the counterpoint to Adam and Eve? Why is Mary at the root of the tree of virtues? I don't have a picture of this in your handout, by the way.
Well,
Any speculation? Yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
Well, she is the new Eve,
Mm-hmm.
and from her, agreeing to be the mother of Jesus, God, brings it salvation. And over.
So when Mary is confronted by God
Mhm.
and his call on her life, she says yes. Whereas Adam and Eve said
No.
no. So a picture of obedience and humility as opposed to disobedience and pride. So here it says the root of the virtues is humility, and out of our submission to God grow all the different virtues. So we've got fortitude, prudence, and all the rest of them. And then we get the 3 theological virtues across the top. And on the virtue tree, what you're growing up into is Christ, your head. Okay, so you get this catechism lesson is trying to make everything neatly parallel. Okay, but you at least get the idea that we're trying to give you the root metaphor with a capital vice title. Why pick
Could I just,
these? Yes, go ahead, Ray.
is the analogy with the tree there,
Mm-hmm.
is that work in terms of, you know, the more I develop the upper part of the tree, the more that feeds and strengthens the root and feeds the whole tree.
It's the other way around, actually. It's that the more that you lay down your own life in humility, the more you can grow up into Christ, who is the ultimate fruit. Christ-likeness is the ultimate fruit of the Virtue Project.
Oh, so you kind of grow past
Well,
the
and
tree.
I'm going to go back here. You notice where are all the fruit growing in this tree? They're growing up, right? Look at the vice tree. They're all hanging down.
Yeah.
So pride will drag you down, and virtue will lift you up toward Christ-likeness. So again, just kind of catechesis by visual depiction here. And notice this tree has a bunch of leaves on it. It's flourishing and it's growing all kinds of life. Yeah, there's all kinds of signs of life and fruit growing, whereas this has all like birds of the night and moths and pictures of darkness, and there's nothing growing.
Oh, excuse me, did you say, I'm sorry, doctor, that, and there where it says British Libraries?
Yes, yep.
Where did?
You can get these online. The British Library has its collection of illuminated manuscripts available online.
So is that from England?
Yes.
Oh.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
So why pick these? Like, are these some magical 10 or 9 or 8 or however many there are? What the desert community did is it singled out these particular vices as probably the world's most common temptations in terms of the things that we use to make happiness for ourselves. So think Augustine's theology here, where he wants to say the big mistake with sin is to take something created and try to make it God. Try to take some created good and make it fill the place in your heart, which can only be filled by an infinite God. Which explains the excessive desire dynamic here, right? If you're going for satisfaction or fulfillment in something finite, in something created, but you're made for eternity and you're made for complete fulfillment only in an infinite object, which is God, finite objects aren't going to fill you. You have to keep going back for more and keep going back for more, and everything sort of exacerbates and gets restless and keeps yearning for more and more and more. So in Augustine's terms, why these 7? Well, these are classic gifts from God, created things, that we try to make gods, that we try to find our happiness in. So this is just me sort of speculating about what sorts of goods are at the root of each of these sins. If your God is your own pleasure or comfort, then lust, gluttony, and so on are going to be more of your go-to sins. If you want to make a God out of approval, human approval, or worth, then pride or envy and vainglory are going to be your go-to sins. If power, control, and status are the things that you are trying to build your happiness around, and so on. So the key with pride is that what it's going to try to do is say, I get to pick what my happiness consists in. And then I'm going to go about getting it for myself. So think of pride as self-engineered happiness. And all of these vices follow that pattern. So they all have a root in pride because they all follow that prideful pattern of trying to get happiness for ourselves. So, Calvin and Hobbes. Getting is better than having, says Calvin. Because when you get something, it's new and exciting. But when you have something, you take it for granted. It's so boring. But everything you get turns into something you have, says Hobbes. I know, says Calvin. That's why you always need to get new things. And that's exactly how the sins work, right? I need to get more. I need to get new things. I need to have more of this and more and more and more and more and more. And it's an endless cycle. And it leaves us, says St. Augustine, restless. That's why restless excess is a hallmark of these signature sins. You have made us for yourself. Our hearts are going to be restless until they rest in you, the object we're ultimately made for. So he diagnoses the heart of sin as looking for pleasure, beauty, and truth, not in God, but instead in created things, myself or other creatures. And if you search for happiness this way, says Augustine, what does it lead you to? Pain, confusion, and error. Hence the self-destructive nature of sin. Okay? Last but not least, these are habitual. Okay? What does it mean to call something a vice? There's different ways we can use the label sin. One label is to describe sort of the human sinful nature in general, sort of our fallen human condition generically. Another way is to name individual activities. So this particular act was an act of stealing, which is a sin. Vice is somewhere in the middle. So vice isn't our fallen human condition in general, and it's not an individual action. It's a habit. That is to say, it's a pattern of action that kind of wears a groove in our character. So it's not just that I steal, I've become a kleptomaniac. Okay, I've become a habitual stealer, and I have this kind of greedy, grasping outlook on the world. And the key with the vices is that they're not like a broken bone, where it's a localized injury, you put a cast on a particular spot, and then in 6 weeks or so it heals. Vice is more like cancer. It gets in you, right? It's pervasive. It affects your whole body. It's hard to beat. It tends to recur, right? And it's because it's so deep in our character. And the thing about habits, good or bad, is that they affect the way that we see the world. They affect our emotions, the way that we feel about the world, and the way we react to things, and they spill over into our actions. So if you read the Desert Fathers on the vices, what they'll say is the first thing that you have to do is block the thought. Because as soon as you let the thought in, it digs its way down into your heart, and it makes you want things. And then you're going around in the world with that kind of orientation, and then you're going to let that spill over into action. All right. So the deal with the vices, that is to say as bad habits, malformed character, is that we're not thinking of your life as a series of individual snapshots. This action, then this action, then this action. We're thinking of your life as a narrative, as a story. So the question to ask yourself isn't, is this thing permitted, or is this thing not permitted, morally speaking? The question to ask yourself is, if I did this every day for 10 years, what kind of person would I become? It's a different frame for ethical thinking. John Cassian, who's one of the Desert Fathers, one of the first members of that community who wrote up this whole program into a kind of systematic story, he likes to use a number of metaphors to explain how this tradition of the 7 deadly sins, or the 8 or so capital vices, helps us think about spiritual formation. So we've gotten through what the sins are. Now let's talk about how we can use them to think about our own spiritual lives. The way Cassian uses the sins is through 2 different metaphors. The first one is the athletes of Christ. So he says, when young monks look at their struggles with the vices, as in a mirror, and have been taught the causes of and the remedies for the vices by which they're troubled, they'll also learn about future contests before they occur, so they'll be instructed as to how they should watch out for them and meet them and fight against them. Okay, so Cassian's strategy here as a spiritual director is to say that the spiritual life in this respect is a lot like the gladiatorial arena. You better get training, because there's going to be some really dangerous stuff coming at you, and you have to be well equipped to know how to fight. You have to know when to run away. You have to know what to do to block and parry. It's a little bit like a football team training for next Friday night. What's the first thing you do on Monday morning after a big game? You watch tape. Where were my defenses weak? Where does our offense need to be more strategic? How can we work together? Right? And then what do you do the rest of the week? You do exercises and drills to make sure that you're strengthened and trained for the next contest. Now the picture here is that it's naming the vice isn't just, you don't watch tape just to sort of think about how bad you played the last game. There would be no point, right? That's just a beat yourself up exercise. Cassian says the reason you watch tape is so that you can train more effectively and do better. So his idea is that sin, the examination that you do with the sins isn't backward looking, it's forward looking. And here's a metaphor that brings that out even more. He talks about your spiritual director under Christ as the physician of soul. So the idea is your ultimate objective is to care well for your soul, to cultivate Christ-likeness in yourself. And that requires sometimes getting a hard diagnosis. So in my own journey in the last 5 years, I had a day, almost 3 years ago, this last month, where I went to a doctor, and the doctor gave me absolutely the worst news of my life. Says, this is not good, and you might not make it, and you've got a tough road ahead. But the point of the diagnosis wasn't to just send me home sick and make me feel bad about myself. Go home to die, right? No, this doctor who gave me the worst diagnosis of my life was also the surgeon who healed me. So the person you're going to for the diagnosis is the person who is going to offer you a treatment plan that brings you toward health and wholeness and healing. In fact, think of the spiritual disciplines that they're pointing you toward as a spiritual wellness program. This is how you really live and live to the full. And that's what the diagnosis is for. It's to free you from disease, move you toward health. Okay? So that's the frame. And one of the exercises that I have my students do, and I included this in your packet, it's your next handout. It's a spiritual exercise called Memento Mori, and this is the remembrance of death. And one of the ways to practice this exercise in self-examination is to look inward and think about your own character. I won't have you do it here now for the sake of time, but you can bring this home with you if you want. In fact, I usually play John Rutter's Requiem Mass while my students do this, so I kind of give them the emotional vibe while they're practicing this exercise. You're supposed to reflect on your death and think about the speech that someone would give at your funeral that summed up your character. What kind of person was she? Was he? What kind of character do they have? Because when we're at funerals, we don't talk the way we talk at graduations or retirements. Those are all about achievements. At funerals, we talk about who you were, what your character was like. So funerals are a great reflective exercise to think about our own character and to think about how far we've come and where we yet need to go. So when my students do this exercise, I have them do a second speech about what they wish their eulogy would say if they had lived into everything God had called them to be. If you're like me, there's a gap between you and your character right now and the you that is exemplifying everything that God wants you to be in terms of your character. And that's the bridge we want to talk about crossing through spiritual disciplines. So the point of self-examination through the 7 deadly sins is to name where we are, and then to move forward through spiritual disciplines and spiritual formation into everything God calls us to be. The New Testament uses words like sanctification to describe this process, and there are a number of texts that sort of make this more explicit. I call them transformation texts because that's what they're about, the transformation of our character from our old sinful nature and its captivity to freedom in Christ-likeness. And so we take off what Paul usually describes as the old self with its bad habits and its old practices, and we put on the new self, which is created to be like Christ. And then he lists off a number of traits: gentleness, faithfulness, kindness, and so on. And those traits are virtue-like traits. They're patterns in our character. So take off greed, immorality, envy, slander, all that kind of stuff. Put on the new traits, which are virtues. So Colossians 3, Ephesians 4, Galatians 5, Romans 12 all talk about that process. This is one of my favorite cartoons called Coffee with Jesus. And there's a disciple of, or a follower of Christ named Kevin, who says to Jesus, "I like being a believer in you, Jesus. You're a good friend." And Jesus replies, "And I like it that you're a believer, Carl, but I prefer that you be a disciple." And Carl says, "What's the difference?" And Jesus says, "Discipline." Okay, so what are we talking about when we talk about the difference between just saying we believe in Christ? Confession, a profession of faith is an important and essential first step, but conversion is more than just the words we say. It's a whole new way of life, and it's living into Christ-likeness, which requires discipline.
Whoa.
Do you want me to go back?
Yeah, I mean, are you saying it's just words to think of Jesus as a friend?
No. I'm
Okay.
thinking that for him, being a believer means just saying the words. I say, Jesus, you're my friend, but I'm not living out that friendship with integrity unless I have the disciplines that mark my life. So thank you for clarifying that. So the way that the spiritual disciplines are supposed to work is that they're supposed to cover every square inch of your life and every square inch of your character and transform it into a Christ-like pattern and out of a pattern of greed or sloth or envy or whatever else. So the picture here is that this isn't a Sunday only. This isn't just spiritual rituals. This is supposed to be practices that infuse our whole life and our whole character with the character of Christ. So take gluttony. You might have a gluttonous habit that leads you into all sorts of bad practices. You can take communion. You can take the Eucharist. That's part of the process, right? That's an important spiritual discipline in its own right. But how you eat in the cafeteria, how you eat at picnics, how you shop, how you think about food, what commercials you consume, all of that is part of the new practice package. Okay? Now, I'll just tell you a short, but I hope somewhat humorous, and for me humbling story about a little bit of fasting that I did, because I got into this tradition and I thought, I'm coming from a Protestant tradition where fasting wasn't a big part of spiritual practice for us. So I thought I need to try this stuff that the spiritual disciplines or the Desert Fathers are talking about. And so I engaged in some Lenten fasting, and it wasn't a total fast. It was a pretty wimpy fast, probably by Christian standards. But at any rate, I did without a significant amount of food during Lent. And during the very beginning of that process, what I discovered is that I was a person with a very fast metabolism, and not eating as much meant I was hungry all the time. All the time. It drove me crazy. And as a result of being hungry all the time, I was also a little crabby. And because I was crabbier and hungrier, I had to not work as much as I did before. I was fueled by caffeine and sugary snacks, and it was wonderful. I was super productive and eating all the time. And I realized that the caffeine and the sugary snacks were all part of the overproductivity program. So as I cut back on food, I didn't have so much energy, and I didn't have so much patience. So I needed to back off stuff a little bit, which meant that I needed to lay down some of the things that I was saying that I was going to do and things that I was trying to achieve, which means I had to prioritize my life a little bit more carefully. If you can't do everything, you're going to have to make wiser choices about what you're going to lay down and what you're going to take up, right? And about 3 or 4 weeks into Lent, I had this little angry conversation with God that went something like this. God, I gave you food, and now all of a sudden you want my time and my priorities too? What happened there? What happened is that the spiritual discipline of fasting wasn't just about food or the pleasure of eating or the efficiency of staying high calorie, high caffeinated all the time. The discipline was really about God getting down into the area of my life that was an idol, the achievement area, and saying, you know, I'm going to need you to lay some of this down and realize that you and your achievements are not running the show. It's actually what I need to do in you that should be your top priority. So spiritual disciplines can often first sound like this. I'm fasting. I'm keeping Sabbath. I'm praying the rosary, whatever it is. You are not about, it's not about you. It's not about your work. It's about being open-handed, about whatever the Spirit needs to do in you. Okay, so all the spiritual disciplines are these kind of ways in for the Spirit to do whatever work needs doing. And you can expect it to affect every single area of your life. How much you sleep, how you work, when you listen, when you speak, how you shop, what you watch on television, your entertainment. It's going to pretty much cover the whole thing. So I'm just saying, be ready. There aren't any predictable scripts as to what's going to happen, but you better believe that God wants to take the whole thing over. So be ready. Notice that what we're talking about here is what I'll call graced disciplines. This is not about our achievement and progress and strategizing. It's not like if you're a good strategist and a super self-disciplined person that you'll be a better Christian. That is not the program. It's also not a program that says, hey, grace covers it all. I don't have to do anything. Right? So there's the kind of overworking, I can be responsible for my own salvation and my own sanctification mistake on the one hand, and then there's the I don't have to do anything. I just lay on the couch and eat chips while the Holy Spirit sprinkles some pixie dust on me or something. Right? This middle way of the spiritual disciplines is that I do something to put myself out there and say, God, do something, do whatever needs doing. But then I'm also open to the work of the Spirit to get the work done. Okay? So kind of a narrow way between works righteousness and cheap grace, if you want to put it that way. So it's not another self-help program like this guy, which I love, Fasting Made Easy. It's not supposed to be easy. It's not about your control over the process, like if you do these 3 things in fasting, you'll have the following 3 results in 7 quick days or whatever. It's just not that kind of, so get yourself out of self-help mode, because this is not self-help. This is something else. Just to give you an example of something that I've tried with my students that illustrates this process, I think, beautifully. And these are the last 2 pages of your handout. You're welcome to take this home as an exercise. It will not be graded, obviously, but something fun to try. So the three central disciplines of desert practice are silence, solitude, and prayer. Those are sort of the three spiritual disciplines that are the hub of the wheel. And so my students and I decided we would try silence. And if you think a little bit, you realize that on a college campus, practicing silence is probably impossible. You're supposed to raise your hand in class, and you better ask your roommate if what they're doing before you come in the room and whatever. So you can't be silent, like a Carthusian monk or something. So we practice this limited form of silence where we just refrain from talking about ourselves. So no self-talk. I can ask you how you are doing, but I'm not going to be splatting all over the place about how I feel and what happened to me today and all this kind of stuff. My political opinions. Imagine if we all practiced that on Facebook. Wouldn't that be wonderful? So the story here was that we couldn't remember to do it. So we committed to practicing this for a week, and what we found is for the first day or two, we would be halfway through a conversation and realize we were just blathering on and on about ourselves, and we'd completely forgotten about the exercise. So we followed the advice of Abba Agathos, who kept a pebble in his mouth for 3 years to learn silence.
Who was that again?
Abba Agathos, he's on your sheet.
Okay.
So we chew gum or keep a Tic Tac in our mouth just to remind ourselves to shut up. It's like took that much discipline just to physically remind ourselves not to be splatting ourselves all over. So as we engaged in this exercise, what we noticed is that other people around us reacted differently. So my kids would say things like, "Wow, Mom, you're kind of quiet today. Are you feeling okay?" Imagine that. All right. So after everyone around us got used to us being quieter, what we found is that other people told us more about themselves. So if you're in a conversation with someone and you know you're not going to be a contributor, what do? You make yourself available as a listener. And you're a much better listener because you're not trying to jump in with your story the minute they take a breath. "Oh, I got a bigger, better story. Oh, listen to what happened to me. Oh, I went through the same thing." No. Shut that all down. It's not about you. So now all of a sudden we were these receptive listeners. And you can only imagine among 20-year-olds on a college campus what that opened up. So at the end of the exercise, what my students reported to me is, "Wow, I feel like my friendships are deeper. And it's only been a week." So what does the discipline of silence do? It's not talking. It's about shutting something down in us. Vainglory, self-aggrandizing, images of ourselves that we want to make sure people get right. Shut all that stuff down. But at the same time, it's opening up a path of life, right? The spiritual discipline is not just about detachment from vice. It's also about rightful attachments, rightful relationships, healthy spiritual living. So that's an example of the way that the spiritual disciplines can work. So what I've given you is the same assignment I gave my students, and I would invite you to try practicing it this week. So this was for us a lesson in laying vainglory down and opening ourselves up to being gracious receivers of others in hospitality and in gratitude. So it was a lesson for us in learning to listen. Why study the vices? To wrap things up here, it's really not about shame and blame. It's not about God's judgment. It's really about examining ourselves to see what needs to die, the part of ourselves that we need to lay down in order to live life to the full. So Christ's baptism and our baptism with him is a process of dying and rising. It's going under and coming up. All right? So that rhythm is something that you'll notice probably for the rest of your life as you grow in Christ. There are things you need to die to, and there are things that need to come alive. And so these formational practices are giving us a kind of picture of that rhythm of life in Christ. So the grace disciplines are Christian practices that are concrete. They give us something to do, right? There's something you have to enact. They're comprehensive in the sense that they're going to cover everything in your life. In the same way that the vices kind of took over everything from carnal to spiritual, covered a lot of territory. again, we've got to reclaim all that territory and grow into Christ-likeness in every area of our lives, not just our Sunday worship, but our everyday grocery shopping, the whole 9 yards. Not only our play, but also our work. Let me remind you, too, that these are meant to be corporate practices. Okay, none of us are meant to do spiritual disciplines all by ourselves. We're meant to do these things as the body of Christ. So if you've ever had the experience of praying with someone during a very difficult time, you know how powerful it can be when 2 or 3 together gather in his name and lift up a petition. In the same way that all the other vices, we need each other for, or all the other spiritual disciplines, we need each other for accountability, for encouragement, and for building each other up. And so I would encourage you not to practice these alone, but to engage in these corporately as the body of Christ. And I'll leave you with this poem from Madeleine L'Engle. She sort of sums up the picture here of what God is inviting us to. In flesh's solitude I count it blessed that only you, my Lord, can see my heart, with passion's darkness tearing it apart, storms of self and tempests of unrest. But your love breaks through blackness. It bursts with light. We separate ourselves, but you rebind in dayspring all our fragments. Body, mind, and spirit join, unite against the night. Healed by your love, corruption and decay are turned, and whole we greet the light of day. And that is the picture of spiritual formation that even this sin tradition invites you to live into. Thanks very much. We have some time for questions. Yeah, go ahead.
There were 3 things you said. We need each other for accountability, encouragement, and...
To build each other up.
Well, that's encouragement.
It
so
is.
What was the other one?
Those were the 3.
Okay,
I made it sound like 3, there were really 2.
Okay. And then the silent retreat. If I go to a silent retreat, I'm silent.
Yeah.
That's not a problem.
It's easier to do in a silent retreat, isn't it?
So where's the challenge?
The challenge is to just be open to whatever the Spirit wants to do in that particular moment. I mean, you could go on a spiritual retreat 10 different times and have 10 different things happen. In fact, Ruth Haley Barton has a really nice book called Invitation to Silence and Solitude.
Who's that?
Ruth Haley Barton. And she actually tracks Elijah in the story where he runs out to Mount Horeb after his showdown with Jezebel and the prophets of Baal. And what she does is she narrates the Elijah story as many different encounters with God. So here's Elijah heading out into the desert. And what does God do first? Well, Elijah's exhausted. So first, God lets Elijah take a nap. Maybe it took so much work to put your life in order to get onto silent retreat that the first thing you need to do is just physically rest. And that's what silence and solitude can provide a place for, and that's needful. We're embodied creatures, so we need to honor that about ourselves. So Elijah rests, and then God wakes him up and feeds him. And then he puts him back down for another nap. And then he feeds him again. Then Elijah gets to climb Mount Horeb and listen in silence for the earthquake and the wind and the fire. Finally, he's ready to hear the silent whisper of God. But that wasn't where God met him on day 1. Right? God gave him all the things that he needed and put him up on the mountaintop in the place where he needed to be to receive the still small voice. And then what does the voice say? It says, go appoint a successor. It's time for Elisha to take over. So it was also an invitation to pass on the mantle to the next prophet of Israel. So what happens in silence? Well, I can't prescribe it. Different things happened to Elijah at all different stages of that journey, right? And I found her book to be a really helpful, just kind of open-ended look at what happens in silence is whatever you need to receive from God, and that can be as different.
But usually, I don't do it very well. What I'll do is I'll take a scripture or something and I'll read it and I'll look at the Hebrew and you know, that kind of thing, and it's all mental. And then lately what I've been doing is I'll take one day and I'll just put everything away except my journal. And that's harder.
Yeah, it is.
But I'd like to go deeper.
Do you have any spiritual direction in that? Yeah, so I would think that would be something to ask a director. What they see, where they see God moving, and where you might be attentive going forward. You really need individual instruction for that. You know, I can give you a generic template for what next.
Yeah, okay.
Who did
I
you say
would-
the author of that book was?
Ruth Haley Barton.
What was the title? I'm sorry.
It's called Invitation to Silence and Solitude.
Thank you.
It actually might be called Invitation to Solitude and Silence.
Oh,
I can't remember
okay.
which order. It's Formatio Press, IVP. Yeah, I mean, let me just say this. There might be times where silence feels dry and empty. And that's why it has to be regular practice. Sometimes you have to show, it's like a relationship, right? Every time you're together with your spouse or your child or your friend, it isn't like electric, right? I mean, there are those times only because you've cultivated the continuity of the relationship over time. And silence is a little bit like encountering the living God that way. Yes?
This is just a comment, Doctor. When you were saying about the listening, there's times when someone's sharing something with me and I feel I have to say something, but I don't need to. So it kind of touched me when you said that, that to be, it's like, it's not about me and I want to share something, but I need to, I'm working on that, where
I think we all need to work on it.
that I don't really have to say anything.
Yeah.
And so
Sometimes what they just need to do is to be received with hospitality, and that's the gift.
and I find that in situations of grief, to listen. That, you know, I'm kind of at a loss for words, but just to listen to the person,
Right.
not necessarily vent, but to share. So I am
And
working
paying
on
attention
that.
is hard. Paying attention is a discipline. It's
I want to say
active.
something, so excuse me. So like I got to say something. I thought, no, Darlene, you don't need to say anything.
Yeah.
So,
I think that's hard for all of us. We love to fix, we love to control,
Yes.
we love to intervene, we love to self-assert. Sometimes it's, like you say, it's not about you.
Not for me, it's not hard for me.
but it took a long time not to go on about this, like with family dynamics,
Yeah.
the fixing.
Yeah.
And it took a long time. Not that I was going to save everything,
Right.
but it took a long time for me to always pray and be supportive. But I can't. I want to save
Right.
everyone.
But to be attentive to people is a real gift. And I think it's especially in an age where we do so many things electronically and by distance, to be an attentive presence to another person is really a gift of welcome. So
I'm working.
yes, just like I said, it's not just what you're not doing, it's an invitation to really be with someone in a
Yes.
different way. So it's a beautiful, beautiful exercise. Yes, right.
When you were talking about the reduction of the ego kind of being the basic fundamental thing.
Yeah, that's why pride's at the root.
Yeah. I was reminded of the verse in the Bible where the rich young man came to Christ and said, what must I do to inherit the kingdom of heaven?
Yes.
And Jesus said, sell all you have and come follow me.
And Jesus puts his finger right on the idol.
Yeah, and I guess what I was thinking was, arguably, us poor people have an immense advantage when it comes to reducing our ego and getting to the kingdom of heaven, because it's arguably a lot tougher to do that if you're surrounded by wonderful food and lots of beautiful willing women and beautiful gorgeous things and a lot of people playing up to you.
Right.
And a lot of people playing up to you to gain your favor because you have control. I mean, in a situation like that, reduction of ego would have to be extraordinarily difficult, I
Right.
would think.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I will say this, in my work on vainglory, I've noted that there are actually two pitfalls. One, the person who has too high a reputation and is too invested in it that way, right? You're seeking glory, you think you have a self that is worthy of glory, worthy of attention, worthy of approval. Come look at me, come and look at me. And you think, well, maybe the people who don't have any glory, they get off easy, right? They don't have this temptation. I actually think they have a different version of it. They have this kind of need for affirmation that they're not getting. But the neediness can also be a temptation, right? You can be overly attached to glory in the sense of wanting it too much because you don't have it, rather than valuing it too much because you do have it. So I do think each of the vices can operate that way. That said, I think different people struggle with different sins, different vices, some more than others. And I also think, like Cassian, you might struggle with different vices at different stages of life. So you might struggle more with vainglory or envy when you're an insecure teenager than when you're, someone who's kind of been around the block a few times and just kind of learned to let a few things go, ego-wise. Maybe you've gone through enough humiliation, and as I've experienced, being sick or aging, you're just not what you used to be, and you kind of get over yourself a little bit. You get out of the game a little bit. And so that temptations will take different shapes at different stages of life. And different temptations might peak at different stages of life. But that's to make a sweeping generalization of the human race, which is always dangerous. So Cassian will say, here's the general trajectory, but the reason you need your own spiritual director is because they need to name where you are at this particular time.
Doctor, I think you did it. I was listening very closely, but when you shared how you got into this with that pusillanimity, but
yeah.
then how, may I ask, I don't know how I want to ask this, that you got so interested in like writing the book and getting, can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. So pusillanimity is an offspring vice of sloth.
Okay.
So when I was investigating pusillanimity, I thought, oh, this explains a lot about me. I should figure out what the root of this is. The root is this capital vice of sloth. Well, nobody really understands what sloth is. And I could give you another hour talk on what sloth is and isn't, because it's a really tricky one. But it turns out that it's not so much resistance to work or effort. It's resistance to the demands that God's love makes on your life.
Would you say that would be like self-esteem? Would that go in there?
Not really.
Because I have low self-esteem.
It's really about, sloth itself is really about not letting God's love transform you.
Oh,
So pusillanimity is a way of kind of copping out when God's call demands you to do things that stretch you out of your comfort zone, which was grad school for me, at least the first semester. And so pusillanimity is related to sloth. Sloth is, of course, anchored in pride. I want my life to be more comfortable than this. I want all the loveliness of God's love without any of the hard stuff, without any of the, you actually have to forgive this person you can't stand, and you actually have to step out in faith on certain things. I don't want any of the uncomfortable stuff. I just want the comfortable stuff. And so I started digging, and I realized, oh, sloth is one of these capital vices. What are those? How are they rooted in pride? And then then I started excavating all of them and taught a class on it, and that's where the book came from.
How long have you, may I ask, how long have you been a professor?
20 years.
Oh.
So this is based on a seminar that I taught in the early 2000s, and I didn't write it up into a book until about 2009.
Oh.
So.
And what, you wrote this in
That was published in 2009.
And then the other book, the other one that you have over
2014. The Vainglory book came a little bit later.
Oh, that's a newer one.
It's on a particular vice. And do I have a program to write a book on each one of the 7? I don't know if I'll live that long. But I do have a book on sloth that I would like to get into print before the day is over.
Okay, well, thank you. I
Yeah,
appreciate
you're
that.
welcome. Yeah, a lot of these books come out of my teaching.
Okay.
So I'm working with this material with
Have you always
students.
been at Calvin?
I have.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
It's a good school.
I was surprised to see sadness as one of the...
Yeah, so that's that tricky tristitia. Yeah, it's not just generic sadness. It's not depression. It's a peculiar kind of sadness that goes with having relinquished everything in your former life and gone out into the desert. And then you're kind of looking back and feeling kind of sad about all the things that you left behind.
What is that word you said?
Tristitia, it's the Latin word for a particular kind of sadness or dejection.
Oh.
But it's not sadness in general. So that's a very good clarificatory point. You don't want to confuse the vices with their near cousins. So you don't want to confuse sloth with laziness. You don't want to confuse this particular kind of sadness with sadness in general. It's a peculiar kind of, comes with worldly renunciation.
In writing this and researching it, do you ever think, gee, why didn't they include like some other thing like hypocrisy
Yeah.
or fear or yeah,
Fear is the one I think.
fear, yeah.
Fear is the one I think could be on the list. It's and I talk about that actually at the end of the book. The way pride is the root, but there's a different way of construing each of these vices in terms of, I'm afraid I won't have enough of, so I'm going to take for myself, I'm going to grasp for myself. So it's a way of thinking about the role that fear plays at the root of all the vices. So I actually wouldn't put it on the list, I would put it as a potential root vice. And there's actually another article that makes the same. Any of you know the Enneagram? So if you look at the 9 types, you're going to see the capital vices show up along with fear.
Yeah, I wanted to toss this out because I have studied especially the 5, which I have a lot of characteristics of, whether I am one or not, who knows, but that doesn't matter. The problem of a 5 is what they call avarice.
Yep.
And I thought, what do you mean? And, you know, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And it was like, it was really almost a lust for knowledge.
Okay. Or a grasping.
A grasp, oh, well, not only that, but holding on to it. It's like I can't get enough, and I'm not going to give it away.
Oh, okay.
So I don't even share what I know.
Miserly hoarder side.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
But it's knowledge, and it's books, and it's, you know, going to classes, and it's all those kinds of things. But I don't share it with the world.
So there's different. I mean, different people make more or less of parallels between Enneagram stuff and the vices. I don't know that the parallels are as close once you dig back into what the tradition was talking about with each of these. I would almost think of the Enneagram as a parallel tradition that has many similar aspects, in the sense that you'd expect psychology to come up with a similar list if they're talking about, okay, what are the things that people typically struggle with? Well, it's addiction to alcohol, and it's addiction to sex, and it's all, you know, it's like tick down the list, you know, it's idolatry of work. It's not too dissimilar from what these desert fathers come up with. So I would expect there to be parallels, but they're not, it's not a one-to-one correspondence. But the interesting point there is that fear does show up on the Enneagram, I think, for good spiritual reason. So that's a good connection to make.
Just a comment. I want to say I'm dumb, but I had you know, capital sins, but this was new to me to be referred to as the deadly sins.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
oh, that's in the
for me.
Catechism.
I know. I don't.
Catholic Church.
I know.
Yeah, they're identified as the deadlies.
I guess
and that's the common cultural name for them. I don't think people would recognize capital vice anymore.
I don't mean to be negative,
No,
but that
that's
just doesn't. That's why I'm here.
Yeah,
It's
no,
a
exactly.
Yeah.
So if you look at, I mean, if you Google 7 deadly sins, you'll get a whole bunch of
I mean,
hits.
I know, excuse me, what they are. I don't always remember them, and
Right.
there's words that we don't maybe use in
Right,
everyday
right.
talk.
Mhm.
But I was like,
Oh,
okay.
the deadly
so,
sins.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's, I would say, the more common label
Oh, yeah.
historically now,
Sure.
but that's a pretty big shift in the way we label the list.
Oh.
And there's plenty of misunderstanding that comes with it. If you read, for example, contemporary literature on the 7 deadly sins, there's a lot of this, excuse me, there's a lot of puzzles over, you know, why would anybody put sloth on the list of the worst things ever? Like, well, they're not the worst things ever.
That's an animal too, isn't it?
And a cute one too, right?
I'm sorry.
Right.
Not to be sarcastic,
Right.
but that's what, you know, I'm sorry, Doc.
So an interesting feature of the current list is when people call them the deadly sins and they look at what's on the list and they're like, you know, why is it torture on there? Why isn't this terrible stuff? You know, why is it murder on there? Why is it, you know, the worst things that you could do? Cruelty. It's not meant to be a list of the worst things you can do. That's not where the list came from. That's not where it originated. That's not what it's about. If you want to name the worst things people do, then just go to the movies, right? It's all over the place. It's not a big mystery. Why pick these 7 out? Very different story behind the why. And because of the label shift, I think we're just making that mistake all over the place of not being able to see that we're not really trying to label these as deadly. Aquinas will say that gluttony has a venial and a mortal form.
Well, it could become deadly in your life
It could.
to let those get out of hand.
Sure.
And
Sure.
so that is, I mean,
It's a possible trajectory.
a death,
Mhm.
you know, and it
Right.
can be. I mean, I'm not telling you, I mean, you're the expert, but
Right. But your insight's exactly right. They can definitely go in that direction. That's the poison spring metaphor. That's the tree that gets strangled by the root. Mhm.
thank you.
You had another question.
Did you see the movie Seven?
I have not watched all of it because it's so ghastly.
Yes,
Oh.
yes. My son, our son,
Mhm.
saw it and he was describing it to me and I said, I don't want to see that
No,
movie.
you certainly don't.
And yet it got me thinking, well,
It's all
7 deadly sins, what are those? And it got me thinking about it. you know.
Right,
It's very
and so I have
disturbing.
in my Vainglory talk, I actually put the cover of the film on a slide.
Oh.
And you notice that Vainglory is missing. So that's a modern list, not an ancient list, the 7 that they go through. But they're talking about behavioral sins in the movie, and they're not necessarily tracking what the tradition labeled as the real problem. The only two sins that it gets right are envy and anger, or envy and wrath, which are the last 2 sins at the end of the film. So there they get at character trait level stuff, and so that's interesting. But as a whole, the film is ghastly, not worth watching, despite Brad Pitt, and it doesn't get the sins right. So it's another one of these cultural versions of the sins that really just has no idea where it's coming from. And these sins aren't necessarily criminal, right? Sloth and gluttony, those aren't criminal activities. They're not even necessarily behaviors that will hurt other people. They're soul destruction. I mean, Augustine would say they're a deep form of idolatry. It's trying to make your own God and worship it on your own terms. It's doomed to fail. Yes, right.
Of course, in the Catholic Church, there's something known as mortal sin.
Absolutely, that's what the deadly label.
Well, yeah, but I guess what what mortal sin means to me
Right.
is that if you do it and keep doing it,
Right.
you're going to die in your sins. You aren't
It's
going to
like
achieve-
persevering in sin, exactly.
Yeah, and
It's
you aren't
breaking
going
a relationship with God.
Right, and you aren't going to therefore achieve eternal life
Right.
if you're dead in your sins.
Right.
Is that the same connotation that is being made to these deadly sins?
Yeah, so these
Gluttony?
sins don't necessarily start as mortal sins, but
Okay.
they certainly can take that trajectory. And anything that's an entrenched habit is going to very likely take that trajectory. Because as you persevere in sin and make it a habit and make it part of your character and a committed part of yourself, that's going to break fellowship with God, right?
And so,
Now, if you're coming from a certain form of the Protestant tradition, and not all Protestants, but some Protestants will deny the mortal venial sin distinction. Various theological reasons, they'll deny that you can once saved, always saved. You get versions of that theology. So they're not going to want to go with the deadly label. They're going to want to stick to the capital label. But if you're coming from the Catholic tradition, you can certainly see the way that capital vices can lead you down the path toward mortal sin. Anybody want to confess their favorite or ask about a particular one? You have the list in front of you.
I have a friend that goes to confession, one-on-one, and he confessed, and he confessed greed.
Oh,
And the priest said, "What?" It almost said like, "What's that?" Because
What's that?
my friend
Oh.
is not the least greediest person I know,
really?
you know,
Okay.
but he thought he was greedy.
Okay, well, that's why you need sometimes we need some discernment in our confession. I mean, oftentimes, here's the interesting thing, we often don't have the moral vocabulary to even know what we're dealing with, right? That was my pusillanimity problem. I didn't have the word for it, and I often have this experience when I'm talking to people about vainglory. They're like, oh, people who want the limelight, people who want to be liked on social media. I didn't know there was a name for that. Well, there is, and I think that's a good reason to take that forgotten vice and revive the label, because it names an awful lot of what's going on in us and in our culture, and sometimes naming something is the first helpful step toward kind of breaking the chains. So I like getting those labels back out and enriching our moral vocabulary. And I mean, let's face it, you can obsess about sin if you want to, right? So
and that becomes an idol.
yeah, that becomes a problem too, right? That's not a healthy path to be on. So you can look at these vice trees and be like, oh my goodness, look at all this florid detail, and you know, people are getting all crazy about the taxonomy. That's really not the point. The point is to try to develop a diagnostic tool that's really helpful when we're trying to understand ourselves and lay our lives before God. And having a rich moral vocabulary is actually really useful for self-examination. But again, just be careful that you don't go overboard on this stuff. The point, remember, is diagnosis for healing. So you need a good diagnostic manual, not so that you can read the diagnostic manual the rest of your life, right? The diagnostic manual is to bring health. That's the point. So if we cover all this under God's love and His invitation into life, that's the spirit in which I think studying the sins under the guise of self-examination is really helpful.
Well, excuse me, just a comment. That vainglory, that what you spoke about, that was one of those that was dropped
Yes.
from the list.
So
Yeah.
my book calls it the forgotten vice.
Right,
because
right.
It's not a label we have anymore.
Right, we just don't.
Yeah.
And obviously we need it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean there are subtle forms of it and there are obvious forms of it, and there are Christian forms of it, which is the really fun part. If you're coming from a religious tradition, to say this isn't just about sort of going after celebrities. It's also about when I want to really, really appear to be a respectable Christian when I know I'm not. I'm totally faking it. What does that reputation gain me? A lot in this world. And so it can be a high-stakes hypocrisy game for Pharisaical Christians, this vainglory stuff. In the same way that, we might have envy be endemic to a Christian community, where what you're envying people is not their fancy car or their beautiful home or their beautiful hair or whatever. You're envying their virtue, or they're envying their gifts from God. So if you've ever seen the film Amadeus,
Oh yes.
there's a story of a composer named Salieri who's envious of Mozart. And Mozart, Amadeus, the film's called Amadeus because his name means gift from God, loved by God. And what Salieri is envious of is that Mozart appears to be loved more by God. God answered Mozart's prayers and gave him this incredible gift of music, and Salieri feels unloved. And so he's envious of the loved brother, right? It's the Joseph story all over again, and it turns murderous. So envy can be something, I think sometimes even more dangerous in a Christian community than sort of the crass sort of Kardashian version of it that we see on reality TV or whatever.
May I ask, how long does it take you to write these wonderful books?
One per sabbatical. So every 7 years I get a year off teaching, and that's when I write the book.
For another one?
I have a sabbatical coming up in 2 years, so I'm ready to write. Actually, I'm trying to revise and expand Glittering Vices, so that's on the deck first, and then I'll.
So you take the whole year and are able to do
Work on
your
a book.
writings.
That's, I'm usually working toward that before I get to that year.
Oh,
So.
okay, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, no, some people write books really quickly, and I'm not one of them.
Well, you're a full-time professor.
Well, yeah, I'm doing the teaching and other things too.
Oh, yeah, not to ask.
No, that's fine. I have a
Personal
few kids too,
questions.
they take a little
How
time.
many children, may I ask?
I have 4.
Are they in middle school or?
One in college,
Oh, wow.
2 in high school, 1 in middle school.
Oh, I just look, I know this, I'm sorry if I put my foot in my mouth. Very, very beautiful and young to have children.
Well, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, and I've vaingloriously taken the gray out of my hair.
Oh.
Any other questions about any of the particular vices or the program overall? The story of vice and spiritual formation.
Oh, I
As I
learned a
recall
lot.
from reading, I haven't finished it, but the glittering vices, each vice seemed to have a remedy.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I
Yeah, but you could.
Don't- yeah.
Is that in your talk today, or?
Well, I'm here talking about the overview, so I
Okay.
didn't talk about, I talked about fasting and I talked about silence as 2 particular spiritual disciplines. Again, the spiritual disciplines don't one-to-one map on the vices, so what is the spiritual discipline that cures envy? I wouldn't say that there's any one-to-one correspondence, like if you're envious, try this. I think with the desert program, what they'll tell you is practice silence, solitude, and prayer regularly, and then cluster the other spiritual disciplines around that sort of central core and see what happens. God usually sort of finds a way in and deals with vices sort of in rings. One of the pictures the fathers use for vainglory is like an onion, and you peel away layer by layer by layer. And so you can think of it as that kind of process. Things get unearthed as you're ready to deal with them. But there isn't, it's not as though you have vice X, spiritual discipline Y gets you to virtue Z. I wish the spiritual life were that clean and easily mapped, but in fact,
Yeah, I wasn't
I think
thinking of
it's
a
probably
formula, I was thinking of suggestions.
yeah,
and
so in the book I do
exploration.
offer suggestions, and sometimes there are practices like for envy, practices of gratitude. It's really interesting psychological research about practicing gratitude. It's quite effective, actually.
Well, and listening.
Yes, yep, so silence is another big one. And I think, depending on the person too, like if you're in a profession that puts you in a lot of people, up in front of a lot of people, in the limelight really often, I think you might need more silence and retreat than someone who is, say, introverted, spends a lot of time in quiet already, doesn't have a very public profession. So you might have different spiritual needs for different spiritual disciplines, depends on your calling, depends on your personality, depends on a number of features.